He started off in Alaska, and he had a small boat, and he kind of came along the coast here. He had to camp overwinter here for 1 year. He made it through here, and then he had to camp again overwinter through there. It took him 3 years to do this trip. Okay? In 2007, and every summer since 2007, you've been able to sail through here in about 3 weeks. Things are changing. This is a house, actually very close to, actually the house was there, it's on the north coast of Alaska, in a town that was called Schmidt. And they made the unfortunate decision when they built their town to build their houses on sand. Now, you remember the old fairy tale, no, nursery rhyme, what was it? I don't know, children's story about building your house on sand. Not a smart idea, as we recently learned. But in all defense to them, when they built their houses, this was frozen sand, and there was just ice on the ocean. But as the ice has gone away, other things have changed. So one of the things that happens in the Arctic is that where there's ice, there's no waves. But where there are no ice, then there's more storms, there's more waves, there's a lot more erosion. And as things have warmed up, this used to be frozen ground, and now is just sand. And so when the waves come, it just gets washed away. So rates of erosion here are tens of meters a year. So anything that was close to the coast is just being washed away. And there's nothing that you can do. Nobody's going to come and build a seawall around these little villages. And so this house has disappeared, this town has disappeared, and everybody has had to move. Things that are changing are already having impacts on people. Hurricanes have impacts on people. Now, I put this in, I could have swapped it in for one of Hurricane Sandy, but this one's actually kind of aesthetically more pleasing. Hurricanes, like from space, are very beautiful, right? But down here, not so much. Right? This was Hurricane Jean that hit Florida, and I use a picture of a hurricane, not so much to make a point about how hurricanes are being affected by climate change. They are, but it's complicated. But to point out that we are vulnerable. And when I've given this talk before, people used to think, oh yeah, but it's only people in Florida that are vulnerable. It's only people in New Orleans that are vulnerable, right? When something like Sandy happens, it brings it all home to a lot more people that we are actually vulnerable much more than we used to think. That we have expectations about the climate that may no longer be valid. Right? And that's the key thing that you have to remember. We rely on the climate to deliver lots of things and to not deliver a lot of things. And we build our lives, we build our societies based on that. And then when the climate starts to change and those expectations are no longer valid, we have huge problems because we've come to expect things and we've expected them for a long time and things are shifting underneath us. This is a familiar sight to some of you, unfortunately. We are building a lot of things in harm's way. This was a woman who was right underneath that same hurricane that you just saw. It's very hard to argue with the ocean when the ocean wants to deposit a beach in your house. But other things are noticing too, right? This is a bluebell. It's pretty, it's a flower, it's nice. But it's blooming about 17 days earlier than it was 50 years ago. Right? You think, oh, well, that's nice, spring comes a little bit early. But spring is a very complicated thing. All the different birds and the animals and the insects and the pollinators have different cues. Some of them are cued by temperature. They've learned that, when it gets a little bit warm, that's when we should come out to find the fruit or to find the pollen. But other cues are a little bit different. Maybe some of the cues are based on light, and that hasn't changed, but the temperature has. And now we get these mismatches when animals are coming out, and they're saying, it's time for that was 2 weeks ago already, we're too late. And that's having very subtle impacts on ecosystems in ways that we're really very ill-equipped to predict. I'm contractually obliged to include a picture of a polar bear in every talk I give. This is one I took actually in Churchill. And they're so cute, but that is not love that you're seeing in his eyes. That is hunger. This is a polar bear that has not eaten for 4 months while it's waiting for the sea ice to reform, and so it's looking at you like your lunch. You have to be very careful. But the fact is that we show a lot of pictures of polar bears, and everybody cares about polar bears. But actually, they're charismatic, they're megafauna. People kind of emote with them. But actually, the poster children for climate change and the animals that we should be thinking about when it comes to climate change are something like these, right? These are pine bark beetles. They're not cute, but they're having a much bigger impact on trees and forests in all the way up through the Rockies, Colorado, up to British Columbia, even Alaska. What's happening is that these little critters are temperature sensitive, it turns out. If it doesn't get cold enough during the winter time, they breed twice as fast. And you know what? It hasn't been getting cold enough in the winter time. And so there's been these huge outbreaks of pine bark beetles. If you've flown over Colorado any time in the last few years, you will see acres and acres and acres of brown forest. It's not because there's not enough water, it's because all of those trees have been killed by these bugs. They turn a forest that looks like this into a forest that looks like that, and it's really devastating. And of course that just adds to fuel for wildfires and the like. So I work for NASA. We are far more famous for piercing the unknown with our extremely phallic-looking rockets. In order to, masculinely take information away from the universe. These are satellites, though. These are satellites that are orbiting the Earth. We have something along the order of 25 to 30 satellites that are in orbit, that are looking down on the Earth, measuring all the different things that are going on. Not completely, but we have a huge amount of information now that we didn't have before due to these satellites. And we had to put it all together. This is the kind of information that you get. It gives you a flavor for what how complicated the system is. This is it's a false color image of temperature. And this is the Gulf Stream, right? You've heard of the Gulf Stream, right? It keeps Europe warm and things. But you can see how complicated the Gulf Stream is, right? All these waves and eddies. This is the cold water that's coming down here. This is the warm water that's coming up and going out. And all of these complications, you've got different, you've got different plants that live on one side or the other, different bacteria, different phytoplankton. You can see a lot of things that are going on, but you can't see everything. You need to use other tools. Plastic ducks. These are actually a collection of ducks that were in a container ship that was coming from China, of course, to the US, and the container fell overboard, and it opened. And something like 20,000 of these ducks and turtles and frogs and beavers started floating in the Pacific. And they were floating in the Pacific, and after a few years, they started landing on the shores of Alaska and British Columbia. And people started saying, hey, have you noticed how many strange rubber ducks we're finding on the beaches? And people started noting down where they occurred, when they were found, when they came. And then, 4 or 5 years later, there was a whole other wave of them. And people started saying, oh no, we can use this to track what's going on. And we can use this kind of information to supplement what we can see from the satellites or what we're seeing from boats in really interesting ways. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, and we need all the information that we can get. So this turned into this great citizen science project where people were tracking these ducks, and some of them even ended up going through the Arctic and ending up in Scotland, and a couple of them landed in Maine, right? You know, if you're walking along the beach and you see any ducks or things like that, they haven't, some of them have lost their colour, but if you see one, let me know. And yes, of course, they were made in China, but they float really well. that was their key advantage. There's so much more that we could be doing, right? This is a picture of somebody, and she's trying to see how alpine ecosystems are responding to climate. And the way that you do that is you go up there, and what she's doing is she's setting out a grid, and she's counting how many different kinds of moss there are in each of her little squares. And you think, okay, well, she's going to get a good idea about this meter, but what about this square meter, or that square meter, or the one over there, or the one over there? We have no idea, right? So our ability to keep track of how many things are changing is actually very limited. And we're doing the best that we can, but we don't know everything that's going on. That's important to know. Other scientists are looking to the past. This is the Columbia ice field, which, like all the other ice fields, is in pretty fast retreat. And the interesting thing about the ice fields, when they leave, is what they leave behind. Right? This tree was left underneath the ice, right? And as the ice is retreating, the tree kind of came up. And you say, oh, well, how old is that tree? Well, it turns out you can actually date it really well by the tree rings. And this tree is about 1,000 years old, right? So this ice had been there for 1,000 years, right? And now it's going away. People might remember Otzi, the Iceman, who was uncovered in the Alps a few years ago, okay? He died there 5,000 years ago, and only now did he emerge out of the ice. And he didn't move, he was kind of stuck in a corner. The snow came, and he was frozen, and then the snow left like a few years ago, after 5,000 years. There was just a study done of ice in the Canadian archipelago, that kind of north, towards the North Pole, and they're looking at where the snow and the ice has just gone, and they're looking at the grasses and things that were just underneath, and they're saying, how old is that grass? And some of it was 1,000 years old, some of it was 4,000 years old, some of it was so old we can't actually tell how old it is, which means that it's probably about 120,000 years old, right? And so these are areas that were covered in ice that are now being exposed for the first time in maybe hundreds of thousands of years. This is a much cushier job. This is my friend Kim, and this is on Palmyra, which is a coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific. And she looks for old coral heads. So this is those old big brain corals that you might have seen on scuba photos and things. And they like trees, they have rings, right? They grow a little bit more each year, and you can tell what the climate was like by looking at their different rings. And so she tries to put together a whole series of these old corals to see how things have changed in the Pacific over the past, whether there's been El Nino events or La Nina events, and how much those things have changed. That's a much better job than I have. We're doing other things too. This is some of the most interesting stuff. These are ice cores. These are long tubes of ice. You go to the top of a glacier and you drill down into the ice. And every year it snows, right? There's an extra layer of snow, and it just gets packed down more and more and more. And so if you go down, you're going back in time. And one of the interesting things is you can go back and you can see there's little bubbles in the ice.